I asked my TikTok audience, do you think that your therapists lie to you? And some people, 68 people to be specific, responded. And this is what they said. 10% said, I'm unsure. I don't know if they do, but now that you've mentioned this, I'm kind of concerned that they might. Then 19% of people said, no, absolutely not. My therapist is wonderful. They would never lie. And then a whopping 71% said that yes, no, I do think that my therapist lies to me at least sometimes, whether it is blatantly or through omission, they definitely lie. And because 71% is a very high percentage, it made me curious as a therapist, is there any research on this? So I got on Google and searched and found some studies that actually talk about this. In a 2015 study published by Curtis and Hart, they found that a whopping 96% of therapists, 96%, lie or have lied either directly or through omission. And 81% of those people have lied directly to their clients. That is a very high number, very high. That's like close to 100%. That's basically high enough that the other 4% who didn't admit it, that was their lie. They were lying to you, not to their client. Or maybe both. So, that made me curious. What are all of these therapists lying about? Because as a therapist, I know how I practice. I know if I do or don't lie. So I got back on Google and found another study. This study goes into the 5 most lied about topics by therapists. And because hopefully you're curious now what those 5 things are, I'm gonna share them. So coming in 5th place was forgetting. And as much as I know this one is real, this is a little bit sad because as therapists, we are kind of trained to be overly perfectly attentive and caring and listening. And therefore, when we feel like we forget something about you, or we do literally forget something that you've shared, that feels bad. And I don't think we always want to share that. I know that when I first started practicing, I didn't like sharing that I forgot things because it made me feel like a bad therapist. Over my years of practice, I have learned that I don't have to hide that. And for the most part, now as I practice, when I do forget something that's important, when it comes up, I will mention that. I'll say, hey, I'm really sorry, I may have forgotten this. Can you refresh my memory? And I have never had a client respond poorly to that. But I still definitely understand the pressure that therapists feel to be perfect listeners and have perfect recall. So is this a good thing to lie about? I would argue no. Should we have to lie about this? I would also argue no. But is it a thing that will probably continue to happen from now till the future because we're not all super secure in our ability as therapists and therefore we want to present well? Yes. Probably. Number 4 on the list was personal values and beliefs. And again, this one makes sense because for a long time, therapists have been trained to be a blank slate, to not impose their personal beliefs or values on the client, and therefore they don't share them. And I would argue that this is primarily a lie that occurs through omission, because unless a therapist gets directly asked, what are your values and beliefs, there's a good chance they won't share them. Now, I will throw a grain of salt in this because there has been a trend in the mental health profession, especially among younger professionals, to be a little bit less of a blank slate and to show a little bit more of their personality, of who they are, of their values. And while I think in the process of doing that, it's very important for the therapist to always ensure that the focus of therapy is not on imposing their own values, but on giving a client a space where they can feel safe, I do think there is actually a lot of value in being more open and honest and genuine about who you are as a therapist, because I think that can actually deepen trust in the relationship. So again, do I think this one should be lied about? Not really. In my own practice, do I lie about this? Honestly, if a client asks me directly, I will usually start by doing like the therapist response, as in, how will me sharing this with you help you? And if the response that they have to that makes me feel okay sharing it, I usually feel okay sharing my own personal beliefs and values, but I will never tell a client what they should do in their own life because that's not my responsibility. It's not my life, it's theirs. Number 3 on the list was their physical or emotional state. And again, this one makes a lot of sense because therapy is about the client. Therapy is not a space for the therapist to come in and unload everything about how they're feeling on the client. And if your therapist does this to you, not just like once in a year of therapy, but like every session, that is a significant red flag. Because in therapist training, there is actually a decently large focus on, hey, as therapists, you have to work through your own stuff so that you don't bring that into session and detract from the client's experience. Because the goal of therapy is to focus on the client. And if a therapist is going to come in and talk entirely about themselves and just unload how they're feeling, that kind of takes away from that. That said, I do think that clients and people in general can actually be more aware than anyone would like to admit, especially therapists. And therefore it's not uncommon, especially if you've been working with a therapist for a while, that you can kind of tell like, hey, something's off. So for me in my own practice, if I'm actually feeling off and the client asks, hey, are you okay? I will be honest. If there is something that off, I'll say, yeah, there's something going on in my personal life. And generally, I try not to get into it too much at all. I just let them know that something is going on, but I also want them to know that I'm still 100% here for them. Because if they can sense that something is off with me, I don't want them to think that what's off with me is because of them. I want them to know that it's something else. Number 2 on the list, whether or not the therapist likes or dislikes the client. Again, this one makes sense. So in an ideal world, everyone would just like everyone, but we do not live in an ideal world, and alas, not everyone likes everyone else that they meet. It's just not a thing. And for the most part, I don't think that liking someone, especially initially, is something that you decide as much as it's just sort of instinctive. And therefore, we don't actually have a ton of control over how we feel. Again, especially initially. What we do have control over, though, is how we communicate about it. And because the goal of therapy is to give the client a space where they feel safe and accepted as who they are, communicating about it in a way that says, I just don't really like you, is probably going to violate that. So therapists, because they're professionals, don't do that. And in all honesty, it almost matters more that the client likes the therapist than that the therapist likes the client. Because therapists are trained to be professional. We're trained to work with anyone. And that means that we usually can. But when a client really likes a therapist, that means they're more likely to trust them more quickly, they're more likely to share more. Honestly, it just kind of helps the process along. So liking your therapist, really good thing. And on a more personal note, I found this one kind of interesting because I find that as a therapist, when I work with people, over time, I grow to care about them no matter what my first impression was. And therefore, I don't really have a problem with disliking clients. And so I'm kind of surprised that this is so high on the list because it makes me wonder, like, how many therapists are there actually out there who truly dislike their clients? Because that's just a little bit concerning to me. I would kind of assume that many therapists are like me who just kind of naturally care about people. It's odd. Food for thought. And finally, coming in at spot number 1 was the therapist expressing thoughts or feelings of disappointment or frustration about the client and their progress. Which again, makes a lot of sense because therapy is supposed to be a place where you feel safe, where you feel encouraged and supported, not a place where you feel criticized or attacked or put down. And interestingly enough, I also had probably the strongest feelings about this point than I did about any of the other 4. Because as a therapist, I don't believe that progress is linear. I don't expect you to come to therapy and be the perfect client who hits every marker at the exact right time at a fast rate and just moves on and grows quickly, because that's not how growth works. Growth is not a linear thing. We move forward, we move backward, and that is to be expected. And therefore, I'm never disappointed or frustrated with my clients for being human, because that's how they were, and I would never want to expect them to be anything else. Which is why, again, this is kind of a concerning reality to me that the most lied about thing by therapists is this disappointment or frustration. And I want to be clear, like, I'm not some perfect human who's like, oh yeah, I just never get frustrated or disappointed with things or people, because I do. But in therapy, my expectation isn't perfection, and therefore it's easier to not be disappointed or frustrated when it's like, no, I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for you to be you and to step into being you. And the reality that this is the number 1 thing that was on this list makes me kind of concerned that therapists are expecting things from their client in a way that's actually not helping the relationship, that's not helping the client grow. And that to me is just kind of concerning and also a little bit sad. If by now you haven't picked up on this, in general, I try and avoid lying, whether it is through omission or blatantly in my practice as a therapist in general, because I think that lying has the potential to violate the safety of the space, and I don't want to do that. That said, in the same way that I don't expect my clients to be perfect, I am not perfect, and therefore I know that it does happen, sometimes through omission, sometimes blatantly. And I would also say that the most common lies that I do in therapy, if I do any, because I do try and avoid them, but the most common ones would be through omission. Because if I am ever asked a direct question in therapy, I answer it honestly, because if you're asking me, I want you to be able to trust me in the same way that I want to be able to trust you for your answers. And that's just who I am as a therapist, and I'm very comfortable with that. I do realize, though, that I do not speak for the entire profession. So if you're a therapist, I would love to hear your comments down below. And if you're a client, I'm just curious, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about the idea of a therapist lying in session? Feel free to leave those comments down below. And if you enjoyed this, I would love it if you would give it a like. If you're interested in more videos like this, feel free to hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I hope that you have a fantastic whatever time of day it is, wherever you are.